Hi guys, and welcome to a task solution guide for section 5.1 in the business economic textbooks. This relates to the task in section 5.1, and it's the task 5.1 to 5.4. In these tasks, we need to calculate the contribution margin per unit, the total contribution margin, and the contribution ratio for the product. We're also given some different scenarios which we might need to calculate or just need to explain what happens if the scenario changes. So let's have a look at it. In the first table here, we'll see the information given to us in the task. In this example, we use 15,000, it's Danish krones, for the selling price, and we have variable unit costs, which is 5,000. And the sales volume in pieces or units are 50. So we are selling 50 units at a price at 15,000 each, and the cost related to selling the product is 5,000 for each product. Please note that it is not at all the task you're giving a total number for the variable unit cost. In some of the tasks, you're giving different information about the variable unit costs, and you need to calculate the total variable unit cost before you can move on. So if there's not a total number, please make a calculation of the total unit cost before you move on with the task. Good. We have the information. Let's go to the next table here on the left. This is where we calculate the total contribution. The contribution margin per unit. And we do that by taking the sales price, which we're giving in the task, and subtracting the variable unit costs, which equals 10,000 in this example. So the contribution margin per unit is 10,000. That is what we have left off the selling price when we have paid for the cost related to the selling the product. Good. Then let's move on to the next table. In the next table, we will calculate the total contribution margin for for all the units, the total lot of total batch of products. In this case, it was the 50. So we have the turnover or revenue, which is the combined selling price of all the products. When we multiply the selling price by the sales volume, we get 750,000. If we do the same for the variable cost, we multiply the variable unit cost with the number of units, and we get 250,000. When we subtract the variable cost from the turnover, we get a total contribution margin of 500,000. That is the total sum of money that is left when off the selling price, in this case the turnover and the revenue, when we have paid for the cost related to selling the product. Good. From these two, we can now calculate the contribution ratio. The contribution ratio shows us the share in the share given in a percentage, which is left when we have paid for the variable cost. So this is the share of the selling price that is left when we have paid for the variable cost related to selling the product. In this case, it is 66.7%. So the 500,000 is in percent of the selling price, 66.7%. Good. Now you have done the calculation, and we have organized the task in the way that you can do a lot of the task in section 5.1. In some of the tasks, you're giving different scenarios. You might need to calculate those scenarios, or you just need to think about the scenarios. If you need to calculate them, please copy the base scenario out and change the factors that you're giving. Let's look at scenario 1. In scenario 1, we are giving a new sales volume. Now the sales volume is 70. And from this we can calculate the contribution margin per unit, which is the same as the base scenario, because we still have the 15,000 as a sales price and we still have the 5,000 as the variable unit cost. So the contribution margin per unit is still 10,000. If we look at the contribution margin in total for the full sales volume of 70 units, we can see that both the turnover and the total variable cost have increased compared to the revenue, compared to the base scenario. This means that we are earning an additional 200,000 extra in contribution margin, and this comes from that we earn 10,000 for each unit and we sell an additional 20 units. So 20 times 10,000 is 200,000, which is the increase we have in the total contribution margin. If we look at the contribution ratio, we can see that this is still the same because we still have the same share, the same percentage of the selling price left when we have paid for the variable cost. It is still 10,000 per unit, which is the same share as it was in the base scenario. And when we multiply it, it still gives the same share in relation to the selling price as a percentage. Good. Let's look at scenario 2. In scenario 2, we're given a new sales price. The sales price is now increased from 15,000 to 17,500. Note that the two other factors, the variable unit cost and the sales volume, is now back at the same as it was in the base scenario. This is the way we always do it. When we are given a new scenario, we change the factor that we are told has to be changed, and the other factors are reset to the base scenario. So the new selling price gives us a higher contribution margin per unit because the selling price is now increased. The costs are the same as it was in the base scenario, but we now have more money left compared to the base scenario because of the increase in the selling price. So when we multiply this to the turnover and the variable cost and the contribution margin in total, this also gives us an increase in the contribution margin because of the increase in the selling price. If we look at the contribution ratio, we can see now that this has increased. It is 71.4%, and this tells us that the share, the percentage of money we have left from the selling price when we have paid for the cost of the product, that is higher than it was in the base scenario. So the share, the percentage we have here in relation to the selling price is now higher than in the base scenario. And we can see this with the percentage 71.4. In the last scenario, scenario 3, we get a new unit cost. The cost of the product is now increased to 8,500. When we do the calculation of the contribution margin per unit, we can see that the contribution margin is now decreased and amounts to 6,500. So this is lower than in the base scenario because the cost is now higher and the selling price is the same as the base scenario. When we multiply this to the turnover and the variable cost, we can see that the turnover now is the same as in the base, which is 15,000 multiplied by 50 units, which gives us a turnover of 550,000. The total cost have increased from 250 to 425,000, and that is because we now multiply 8,500, which was the unit cost, with the 50 units, and that gives us a total variable cost of 525,000. This equals to a contribution margin in total of 325,000 for the 50 units. The percentage now is lower because now there's less of the share that is left of the selling price. The turnover when we have paid for the cost is now lower than that it was when we in the base scenario. So we now have 43.3% left of the turnover or the selling price when we have paid for the cost of selling the product. Now we have done all the calculations that we need to do in these tasks, but you might not need to do this section in all the tasks, only if you're asked for it. So if it says do the calculations, you need to do these, and if it just say that you need to 3 scenarios and what happens with the contribution margin per unit, contribution margin in total, and the contribution ratio compared to the base scenario, you just have to think it through. And if you can't really see it, it could be a good idea to do the calculation because that will show you. So let's look at the relationship between these 3 and these 3. In scenario 1, we had an increase in the sales volume that had no effect on the contribution margin per unit. So we can set an X in no effect, the contribution margin per unit. That hasn't gotten higher. It had no effect because it didn't get neither less or higher. If we look at the total contribution margin, we can see that this increased, so that is higher than compared to the base scenario. And the contribution ratio is the same, so that had no effect when we increased the sales volume. So sales volume do not have an impact on the contribution margin per unit. It does not have an effect on contribution margin, contribution ratio, but it has an effect on the contribution margin in total. Good. Let's go to scenario 2. In scenario 2, we got an increase in the sales price. That had an effect on the contribution margin per unit. That was increased. So the contribution margin per unit is higher in scenario 2. And it also had an effect on the total contribution margin, which also was increased compared to the base scenario. So the contribution margin in scenario 2 is higher. When we looked at the contribution ratio, that also increased because there was an increase in the contribution margin per unit. So this means that the contribution ratio increased, so that is also higher in scenario 2. Now there's only scenario 3 left, and scenario 3 we were presented with an increase in the unit cost, which resulted in a decrease in the contribution margin per unit. And we can see down here in scenario 3, the contribution margin per unit is lower. That means it is less, so we put an X here in less. The contribution margin in total is also lower than the base scenario, so we can put an X in less for the total contribution margin. The contribution ratio was also lower, So the contribution ratio in scenario 3 is also lower. And this was because of the increase in the cost. So the task in section 5.1 is about the contribution margin per unit. It's about the contribution margin in total, and it's about the contribution ratio and the relationship if one of the factors changes, either sales price, the variable unit cost, or the sales volume. I hope this gave you an idea and will help you in solving the task for section 5.1. Have a good time.